Good morning. Good morning. Let's begin. My name is Louise Richardson. I'm the president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Thank you all very much for joining us at this Higher Education Summit to discuss the role of higher education and social mobility. Warm thanks to Nick Harrison and the Sutton Trust team for organizing this summit and for commissioning the research which we'll be discussing today. And thanks too to the team at CGHE, the Centre for Global Higher Education, and SCOPE, Skills, Knowledge and Organisational Performance, who are based at the University of Oxford and UCL, for conducting the research that will launch today's discussions. The report, Degrees of Difference, provides a comparative perspective on intergenerational social mobility and higher education internationally. And for those who can't attend, this event is being live streamed, just so you're all aware. Now, throughout the day, we'll have a number of very interesting and incisive speakers and panels, including 3 keynote speakers. The Right Honourable Baroness Smith of Malvern, Minister for Skills, the Right Honourable Damien Hines MP, former Education Secretary, and John Friedman, co-founder of Opportunity Insights. The Sutton Trust was founded by Sir Peter Lampill in 1997. It's the leading social mobility charity in the UK. From its first summer school with 64 students at the University of Oxford in 1997, it has grown to supporting almost 14,000 students every year. In addition, the Trust has commissioned at least 300 policy-relevant research reports, such as the one underlying today's discussion. I was privileged to be a member of the Board of Trustees until last year, and during that time witnessed the transformative impact of the programme on the participants, as well as the public impact of the research on policy debates. So Carnegie Corporation of New York is delighted to sponsor this conference and this research. Carnegie was founded by the Scottish immigrant Andrew Carnegie in 1911, and we have been investing in education, amongst other things, ever since. Andrew Carnegie lacked a formal education, having started work as a bobbin boy in a Pittsburgh cotton factory at the age of 12, but he believed passionately in opening up access to education for talented people like himself who lacked the means to gain education. Amongst other things, he funded the construction of 600 public free libraries in the UK and Ireland. So we today have tried to honour that legacy in the decades since by investing tens of millions of dollars annually in education, primarily in the US, but also in sub-Saharan Africa. We've worked closely with the Sutton Trust over the years and have sponsored several previous summits, including those in 2008, 2012, 2016, and 2018. Just last week, I announced the appointment of James Quall, Undersecretary of Education in the Biden administration, as Vice President in charge of our education programs. And that was before yesterday's news dismantling the Department of Education in the US. We'll hear more about the findings of the report in the course of the day, but the headlines are somewhat sobering. Despite rising graduate attainment amongst first-generation students and a gradual increase in social mobility overall, that growth is flatlining, and in the UK, the graduate premium has fallen sharply. The report does mention rigorous US data that attending the most elite institutions has a marked impact on social mobility. This is consistent with somewhat less rigorous data from Oxford that there was almost no gap in graduate outcomes based on socioeconomic background. My own view, perhaps inevitably given the positions I've held, is that there is far too much public attention to a handful of elite institutions, Oxbridge in the UK and the Ivy League in the US. These institutions can and do propel the social mobility of disadvantaged students who attend, but the numbers necessarily are small. To have impact at scale, I believe we should shift our focus to those institutions that attract many more students and prepare them for the workforce. The work of Raj Chetty at Harvard and John Friedman, from whom you'll be hearing later today, demonstrates where the greatest impact can be had. This report comes at a time when higher education in the US and the UK are in flux. UK universities are in the grip of a financial crisis with soaring costs and declining revenues. We've also just had the skills white paper, about which I'm sure we'll be hearing more today. In the US, universities have experienced a collapse of public confidence and find themselves at loggerheads with the administration. Universities are trying to work out the implications of affirmative action being struck down by the courts and DEI being banned by executive order. Previous standard elements of the admissions process, like a personal essay, may now be illegal if they can be used as a proxy for race or other protected characteristics. Early indications are that elite institutions are admitting far fewer diverse cohorts. We tend to think of access and social mobility as issues for home students, but both the US and the UK, as well as many other Anglophone systems, are, for wider political reasons, fairly hostile to international students at the moment. This has financial implications for the sector and its ability to spend money on access initiatives. The UK government is trying to address this by committing to spending some of the resources gained through the new international fees levy on maintenance grants. But if that pushes down international numbers, many institutions will be worse off. On Monday, the Institute for International Education released data indicating that the number of new international students enrolling in US institutions has dropped by 17% this year. So, all in all, this is a challenging time for higher education sector and a very appropriate time for a report such as the one we'll be considering today. So, I'm now delighted to introduce our first speaker, who will speak to the government's vision and plans for higher education in the UK. The Right Honourable Baroness Smith of Malvern has been Minister for Skills, including apprenticeships, further and higher education, since July 2024, when she joined the House of Lords. She is also Minister for Women and Equalities, taking on lead responsibility for gender equality, women's rights, and the UK Equality Framework. As of September, her role spans both the Department of Education and the Department for Work and Pensions, in order to align skills policy more closely with the labour market and employment reform, placing further education and training providers at the heart of the government's growth agenda. Please join me in welcoming Baroness Smith of Malvern.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for that introduction. And I'm delighted to be here today to talk about something that is very close to my heart. I was the first student from my excellent comprehensive school in Malvern, Worcestershire, to go to Oxford. And I've never forgotten what it's like to stand on the threshold of a venerable institution and think, blimey, what's this going to be like? And should I even be here? I benefited from an access scheme run by Hertford, my Oxford college, and their pioneering approach to outreach gave me the confidence to apply. And that's always at the back of my mind when I think about access and participation. And by the way, Louise, I agree with you that when we think about access and participation, we should think far more broadly than simply the most elite universities. But I also believe that we shouldn't be satisfied for any of our young people with not pushing them to aspire to the very highest that they can achieve. It's not just, of course, when we think about access and participation about prior attainment or entry requirements. It's about making sure that those without a family tradition or some of the other social connections of higher education feel welcome in a very unfamiliar place. It's about ensuring students have access to the right support in order to fully realise their potential and make the best decisions for their future. It's about being ambitious and not letting their background or circumstances hold them back, and allowing their hard work to take them as far as they want to go, to places and institutions that they might otherwise have dismissed. A place where they will then be supported to learn and thrive and graduate, and if they choose to go on to higher study as a postgraduate as well. Access isn't just about getting disadvantaged applicants over the threshold and thinking that's the job done. Because these students continue to have a far higher dropout rate than their peers. And their lost time and money, their regret at chances missed, is far worse than it is for those with other resources to fall back on. The class shortfall in graduates should prick the conscience of vice-chancellors and all of us engaged in higher education policy, just as much as the class shortfall in admissions. As the Robbins report set out over 60 years ago, higher education has a fundamental role to play in shaping and enriching the society that we live in. And that's why it's vital that access to higher education should be based on ability and attainment, not where you happen to live or simply the success or otherwise of your parents. Despite record numbers of people going to university, huge gaps between disadvantaged students and their peers remain in access, in completion, in postgraduate study, and later outcomes. The latter point, of course, is backed by your research, which shows graduates from advantaged families still maintain an edge when it comes to the highest earning potential. Within the landscape of the UK, the difference in higher education access between regions also shows that whilst potential is everywhere, opportunity is not. As a government, we believe in education for what it means for our society and our economy, but also for its own sake, because a more educated society is happier, healthier, more cohesive, and socially and culturally richer. I know that the higher education sector in the UK has shown commitment to expanding access to undergraduate courses, but there's more to be done and there's further to go. We need to recognise and consolidate best practice with a consistent approach. Higher education is often tied to locality for disadvantaged young people, as family income means that they're more likely to live at home while studying. They shouldn't be subject to a postcode lottery of their local university's welcome and support. Since becoming a minister, I have seen some excellent initiatives which could be replicated elsewhere. In September, I visited the new University of Bristol, Hartcliffe and Withywood micro campus. It operates in a postcode with one of the lowest rates of higher education participation nationally, according to the Sutton Trust's Opportunity Index. But it's an excellent example of a new delivery model opening up opportunity in an area that has historically been left behind. And just down the road from here, we have King's College London's letter writing initiative, which I and the government have been happy to support. Crucially, these letters written to Year 12 pupils are from King's students with similar disadvantaged backgrounds. They describe the opportunities of higher education from the perspective of people who've recently been through all the academic, logistical and cultural challenges that go along with the experience. So we believe that every young person with the desire and aptitude to go to university should be empowered to do so. Our post-16 skills white paper sets out our vision for a reformed system that widens participation, breaks down the barriers to opportunity and supports growth. We want the regulatory system to encourage the sector in this direction. That's why the white paper sets out how regulation of access and participation plans will move towards a more risk-based approach. There'll be greater accountability for providers who are lagging behind, with the expectation that they rise to meet the level of others. For those that are doing well on this measure, there will be reduced bureaucracy and a greater focus on continuous improvement. And for the first time, we will also examine the barriers faced by disadvantaged students in accessing and succeeding at postgraduate level. The higher education sector will be critical to making these ambitions a success. We want to bring together colleagues, immense knowledge, expertise, and conviction of purpose to encourage innovation and to share best practice. And that's why we've established a task and finish group of sector experts to focus on how the HE system can further widen access for those from disadvantaged backgrounds. The group will be chaired by Professor Catherine Mitchell, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Derby. It had its first session yesterday, which I was delighted to be able to attend part of. It will look closely at regional disparities and tackling the systemic barriers that bar the path to university for disadvantaged students. That includes working to bring the sector together on a clear approach to contextual admissions so that potential ability can be recognised wherever it's found. Money is the obvious, sometimes unspoken bar to higher education. We want to support disadvantaged young people to invest their time and minds in courses that hold great potential for their future. So we will introduce targeted maintenance grants for students from low-income households studying courses that support the aims of the UK industrial strategy. The last government abolished maintenance grants in 2016. We're now taking action to put this right. At the same time, maintenance loans will be increased in line with inflation, and care leavers, probably the most disadvantaged young people in our society, will automatically receive the maximum support available. But we also need to adapt to meet the changing needs of society. People change careers more frequently, and the need to upskill and learn throughout working life is becoming ever more necessary. Despite those changes, the student finance system still mostly operates on the assumption that learning only happens early in life. We've got to support learning at every stage and allow would-be students the choice, the opportunity and the flexibility to learn in a way that suits them across a broader range of courses. So from January 2027, the lifelong learning entitlement will replace the student finance system. It will continue to fund students entering higher education to take traditional degrees, but it will also fund new, flexible modular pathways, widening student finance to a broader range of courses and learners. That includes those returning to education later in life, who may be working whilst studying, and those who need to take time out of tertiary education for caring responsibilities. The lifelong learning entitlement will leave the door open for them to return and to build further credits. The Prime Minister recently announced a new ambition that 2/3 of young people gain higher level qualifications, including degrees, higher technical qualifications and apprenticeships. This ambition is not about deprioritising universities, it's about ensuring that opportunity is available to everybody and that the value of qualifications at levels 4 and 5, which our labour market is crying out for, is widely recognised. Raising attainment from level 4 up will help us to deliver the industrial strategy by strengthening growth and productivity. And universities have a big role to play in driving that change. We need a whole system approach to skills where collaboration between higher and further education partners is the norm, not the exception. It's about building a tertiary education system with no artificial barriers or unnecessary gatekeepers, one that recognises that facilities used to teach undergraduate engineers can also be used for a wide range of higher technical qualifications delivered across HE and FE institutions. Supported by a clear and robust regulatory framework, we want universities to reach into their communities to nurture talent and potential wherever it is found. Of course, tertiary education follows the work done by teachers at primary and secondary level. How well a child does in school is, of course, a key indicator for their success in higher education. That's why we're also taking steps to address the attainment gap between disadvantaged pupils and their peers. Our new RISE teams are raising standards in every school for every child. The independent review into what's taught in schools has just been published, and that will help to shape our plans for a broad, high-quality curriculum. And we're progressing on our manifesto commitment to recruit an additional 6,500 new expert teachers during this Parliament. We're spending over £3 billion on the pupil premium this financial year, targeted funding for state-funded schools to help their most disadvantaged pupils achieve their potential. And we're extending free school meals to help families' finances and pupils' attainment. And we'll shortly publish our child poverty strategy to tackle the structural and root causes of disadvantage. Supporting access and outcomes for disadvantaged groups is about tackling a range of practical barriers. But these often sit alongside deep-rooted cultural and social issues for which there is no single solution. What's important is that we don't let up. We must keep looking at the problem from all sides, working together across sectors to find solutions, supporting the aspiration for all our young people to do well, not simply to be able to pluck some children from disadvantage. I want to thank everyone here who worked on this research. Despite the variance in how it's recorded and defined, you've built a fascinating global picture of social mobility through higher education. Universities are incredible national assets and international ambassadors for their nations. But behind the prestige, it does matter who goes to them. Closed shops that are just for elites are, of course, ultimately self-defeating. They deny the fundamental principles that academic institutions should be meritocracies. But narrow access to higher education is also morally wrong. It denies social justice by shutting out people who deserve to be there and deserve the life chances that follow from a good degree. Both of these imperatives should spur universities to do better when it comes to widening admissions and welcoming in talent. And it should spur us in government to support them. Thank you for caring about access to higher education. Thank you for coming, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of today's discussions. Thank you.
Questions from the audience? Or?
Yes? Oh, yeah. Oh, I'm chairing myself, am I?
Yeah.
All right, okay.
Yeah, let me try that.
Nick.
Yeah.
Always quick, Nick.
Go on, Nick.
Someone has to start. Thank you. It gives me partly an opportunity to plug a report we've got out at midnight, which is on the percentage of students who do paid employment during term time and how that's doubled from about a third of students, this is young full-time undergraduates, from about a third to about two-thirds over the last decade. And given what you said about financial support, I just wondered what your reaction to that sort of number was. What do you think about students working quite large numbers of hours very often during term time in paid employment?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, I talk, I talk, for example, to NUS about the experience of students. Students talk to me directly about that experience. And as your research shows, Nick, I think there are increasing numbers of people juggling that higher education experience with also having to work. So I think that leads us to two things. First of all, it does lead us to the financial support that I outlined, both in terms of the reintroduction of maintenance grants, the index-linked increases in maintenance loans, but also leads us, I think, to an understanding that people may now be experiencing their higher education in different ways. So I suspect alongside the numbers working, we also have this growing number of young people who are thinking about living and studying locally, for example, which means we need to think about different ways in which universities are thinking about their needs and their welfare, different ways in which courses are being offered, the opportunities, as I suggested, of the LLE, not only to find a different way to support people in their student finance, but also to drive the sector to think about different ways of offering courses, both in the traditional sort of 3 years at the beginning of your working life and through working life as well.
Great. Next, any other more questions? Go on. The mic's just coming down, yeah.
Hi, I'm James Robson, Director of Scope. Thanks so much for that really interesting presentation. It's obviously fantastic, I think, to see in the white paper a real emphasis on collaboration between FE and HE. And for me, I think that's the mechanism for unlocking place-based opportunity. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the ways in which collaboration might be encouraged between FE colleges and higher education institutions. You know, from a government perspective, what is the actual key to creating those sort of collaborative environments and relationships?
Yeah. So, James, thank you as well for the work that Scope does, and I was pleased, I think it was earlier this year, wasn't it, to come and talk to Scope about the sort of post-16 system as I saw it, and I think for anybody who's interested, that speech is still available somewhere or another. But this is an interesting question, isn't it? There's been quite a lot of response to the white paper, and you didn't fall into this trap, but there's been quite a lot of response to the white paper that has said, so how are you going to make this happen? The answer to that, I think, is not all of this can be driven by or directed by government, nor should it be if you believe in an institution, or institutional autonomy in the higher education sector. I think it's the responsibility of government to set in place the objectives, the vision for the sector. I think it's the responsibility of government to support things like the financial position of students, as I've suggested, to ensure that where the government is responsible for levels of revenue coming into universities, like with tuition fee caps, for example, they take action. But having set out that vision, I'm afraid there is an element of saying to the sector, right, okay, so how are you going to now work in order to deliver that? And that goes for collaboration as well. I don't think I could have been clearer since I've become a minister that that's where I think there's a real opportunity for more work. And I am beginning to see, some examples of that. Universities working with further education in order to think about cold spots in areas, to think about efficiencies in terms of, and working with each other, by the way, as well, to think about efficiencies in the way in which they operate, thinking about routes for individual students through both further education and higher education, and in what we're proposing with respect to thinking about breakpoints at the end of year one and year two. I hope that what we're doing is providing a framework that would enable a more flexible way of thinking about the way in which you might access courses. So, of course, there's a responsibility on government here, but and we will continue to take that responsibility, but there also needs to be some ownership from the sector, and I hope and believe that that's what we will see.
Great. I think we'll go to yourself, and then we'll go to the other side, and then we'll come back. Sort of mic in the middle here, can we just get? Just here.
Thanks very much. I'm John McKendrick, Commissioner for Fair Access in Scotland, and warmly welcome so much of what you said, and interested in the points you made about targeting poverty-related attainment gap in schools, which of course is a good thing, but I also think there's inherent dangers there, and what it leads to is an instrumental approach to education, poor practice, where it's all about getting the bit of paper rather than necessarily get the foundations of learning. And what can be done within schools to prevent schools just being factories to get access to universities rather than encourage that way to learn and a thirst for learning?
Okay, I mean, first of all, if schools facilitate more people to go to university, that is a good thing. But I take your point, and that's of course part of the reason for the framework that the government set in England around the curriculum and assessment review that we've just published and responded to. And there is a strong emphasis on how you broaden the curriculum, how you maintain the depth of knowledge that's necessary for all students to succeed, but how you broaden the curriculum, how you introduce other skills that young people are going to need throughout their lives. And then through the standards work that we're doing, how you make sure that that's accessible to all students wherever they are.
Great. I think we have a question on the other side, in the middle there. Then we'll go to the lady at the back, then we'll come back across. And then we may be out of time.
Hi there, David Kernahan from Wonky. Since the start of the Office for Students in 2017, higher education providers have prepared and enacted a lot of access and participation plans. Often they've had to tear these up and start again or refine them midstream because of changing government priorities. I know that the new system is in development still, but can we commit to a long-term, stable approach to access and participation? And linked to that, the most recent set of access and participations plan, it's explicitly take a risk-based and a regional approach. There's some excellent work in there, and I'm interested in what made the DFE think that that particular group of plans was not up to the job.
Well, David, I think you've sort of identified part of the problem with the existing regime around access and participation plans, which is, important though it was to expect institutions to set that out. If they are more about the writing of a plan and more about the bureaucracy of regulation than they are about achieving outcomes, then they won't succeed. And that's the reason behind, as I said, a shift towards a more varied approach, so that more of a focus on where outcomes aren't being achieved and institutions who aren't taking that seriously, and less bureaucracy and less focus on those who are achieving success, and to sort of move away from the idea that the challenge is to produce a plan and more towards the challenge to actually achieve outcomes. Can I promise you that government won't respond to events and change its objectives and priorities? No, of course I can't. But what I can say is that I think in the white paper, this is we're not going to be doing this again next year. This is a longer term vision and set of priorities that I think people should gather around and work towards.
Great, thank you. A question at the lady at the back there.
Hi, I'm Ashley Hope from Guildhall School of Music and Drama. I think most people in the sector will welcome the return of maintenance grants for low-income students. Working in an arts institution, I'm really concerned that that is intended to be funded from the International Student Levy, and those grants are going to be linked to particular degree programmes that are outlined within the industrial strategy, which is probably not going to include music and drama. And I'm just concerned about the impact that has on student choice, and that we are possibly going to be pushing low-income students from underrepresented backgrounds into studying subjects that they might not be as inclined to study if grants were available more widely. So just love to know your opinion on that.
Yeah. So this is a decision made, let's not forget this is a decision made at a time of considerable fiscal challenge for the government. The fact that Bridget Phillipson, who absolutely felt passionately about the need to reintroduce maintenance grants, was able to find a route and to convince the Treasury of the need to do this as an important start to the reintroduction of maintenance grants, is to her credit, in my view. But don't anybody in this room think it was an easy thing to win, right? That's by way of saying I wholly understand your point that this is if you like, this is, as we have said, a targeted approach, and it will, by definition, leave out some students. But it's an important step forward. And the use of the international student levy, I'm not accusing you of this, but, if I hear one more person saying to me, given the financial challenges that we face as a department, of course, we're really keen on the ends, maintenance grants, but we're really not that happy about the means, international student levy, without providing any solution to where they think the money should come from. I will probably run screaming from a stage at some point or another. But it is also a broader argument about, higher education justifiably continues to say international students provide us with income that we can use elsewhere. The International Student Levy is an opportunity for everybody to see the way in which the benefit of international students is being recycled in the UK for the benefit of the most disadvantaged students at home. And if we want to maintain support for higher education, I think that's a pretty important message to be able to send.
No, indeed. Probably got time for 2 quick questions. I've got one at the front and then maybe one last one, but quick questions, please.
I'll try and be quick. Simon Roy from the OECD. Very interested by your point in the white paper about expanding or the role of higher technical education, level 4 and 5 education. That's a challenge in many of our countries in terms of sort of building the prestige of that sector, developing that. I just wonder if you might expand a little bit on sort of how you, given the sort of history in this country of the focus on higher education and elite higher education, how you sort of what the actions you think are needed to sort of boost that sector in terms of its perceptions about it in society, really.
Yeah. Well, one of the first things that helps to boost its prestige and what people feel about it is for the Prime Minister to make it an explicit target, to talk about it passionately, as he has done, not just in his party conference speech, but on other occasions as well, and to prioritise it across government through the target that he sets as the sort of context for the tertiary system. That's pretty significant, I think. Then we need to, there'll be a whole range of other things that we'll need to do, both practically and in terms of messaging, to be able to shift, to up the numbers of people doing level 4 and 5 qualifications. You'll know from the OECD that we have a internationally high number of people who achieve level 6 qualifications and a internationally low level of people who achieve level 4 and 5. So that's the sort of problem, if you like, that we're aiming to solve here. And there will need to be a whole range of ways that we go about achieving that. But you're right that part of that is around prestige, and the message has come very clearly from the top that is important for the Prime Minister, for this government, and we think for the country as well.
Great. I'm afraid we're probably out of time there, so thank you. So look, thank you again, Jackie. Great to get your thoughts as we kick off the conference, and really appreciate you coming along. And look, interesting already to hear you talk about success as well as access, postgrads as well as undergrads, as well as the full spread of institutions, not just the top end, but all the institutions, and the importance of non-graduate routes, of course, which are all topics we'll come back to as we go through the day, I'm sure. So I'm Nick Harrison, CEO of the Sutton Trust. Look, it's great to see so many of you here today on a wet, rainy, awful morning. I'm going to be chairing the first panel in a few moments, but before that, we're going to hear from the report authors, who'll share key findings on what has been a brilliant and really comprehensive piece of work looking at higher education's role in social mobility across multiple countries. So let me introduce Rachel Brooks, who is Professor of Higher Education at the University of Oxford and current President of the British Sociological Association. That's hard to say. And Rachel's research focuses on international student mobility, student politics and protests, interesting few years for that, and equity in access and outcomes. And then we also have Golo Henseke, who is Associate Professor at the UCL Institute of Education here in London. And Golo's work focuses on economics and quantitative social science. You did many of the numbers in the report, and particularly on labour market dynamics, skills and well-being. So Rachel, I think it's over to you first, yes? Oh, come up together. Great, so welcome.
thank you very much for the welcome, Nick, and it's great to be here today to talk about our report. We're going to share it, so there'll be a little bit of swapping between the two of us. But I just wanted to start by saying a few words about the rationale for the research. So as we've been hearing already this morning, social mobility remains a key challenge for both the UK and the US. And one example of that is when we look at the 2020 Global Social Mobility Index that was produced by the World Economic Forum. And in that, out of 82 countries, the UK and US ranked 21 and 27th place, respectively. And so I think the government's shift in policy, as we've also been hearing this morning, to higher level learning presents an opportunity to re-examine the role of higher education, specifically in intergenerational social mobility. And our research was intended to see what we can learn from other countries through an international comparative study. In terms of the methods that we used, we conducted research between February and September of this year, a team from Oxford and UCL, and we drew on three main sources of evidence. First of all, case study country analysis. In our case studies, we included the UK and the US, and then 5 countries with higher rates of social mobility in the Global Social Mobility Index: Australia, Canada, Denmark, Ireland, and Japan, and 2 with lower rates: China and Greece. And in each country, we conducted online interviews with 2 experts, mainly academics, a few policy actors, and also conducted quite an extensive analysis of relevant literature, primarily academic literature, but also some policy documents too. And then alongside that, we conducted analysis of data from the OECD's Programme for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies, which we refer to as PIAC. This enabled us to do both longitudinal and cross-sectional analysis. And as Golo will explain, there were 20 countries and economies involved in that part of the project. And then finally, we conducted 4 thematic workshops with international experts in which we fed back some of our initial findings to them, and that was the basis for discussion. These were online, and we had 21 contributors from a range of different national contexts. These were structured around the themes of access and participation, funding, and alternative pathways, all with respect to intergenerational social mobility. So we're going to now take you through some of the findings from that research, and Golo is going to start with some of the key findings from the PIAC data analysis.
Good morning from me as well. I'm going to talk you through the numbers. The question we set out to answer was seemingly simple. Does expanding access to higher education actually deliver social mobility? And the answer, as you'll see in the report, is less straightforward than some, and perhaps our funders, have assumed. In what follows, I give you the headline figures first, and then talk you through the charts and the more detailed results. That way you get sort of the key insights right from the start. So let me start with what we found using the OECD data covering about 20 countries and economies, focusing on adults in their late 30s and early 40s. So people whose careers are established enough to assess outcomes. First, the good news: higher education delivers. Across all countries, graduates are substantially more likely to reach the top 20% of earners than non-graduates. But there's a nuance to this. Whilst first and family graduates, so those whose parents didn't go to university, fare much better than their non-graduate peers, they still don't always catch up with graduates from more advantaged families. So let me give you the US numbers to make this more concrete. In the US, we see 30% of graduates from non-graduate families, first-time families, reach the top earning quintile. That's compared with just 10% of their non-graduate peers. That's a 3-fold boost. That's powerful. But if we look at those from graduate families, the higher education uplift is almost 4-fold, from 11% to 41%. The real concerning part, however, that we found is when we compare the graduate payoff over time in the OECD data, there was an about 8 percentage point drop across the countries for those first and family graduates with probability of reaching top earnings. The boost they get from higher education has declined significantly between those two cycles of the data. Higher education is thus an engine of mobility, but it may be sputtering. So that's the key insights. The rest is going to be more detail. Yeah. Is this? Okay. Did I miss a slide? Okay, and then let's continue. Before I show you what happened, let me quickly ground you in our methodology. We used the 2 cycles of PIAC data. The first one was collected 2012 and in a few countries a little later, and the more recent one, 2022-2023, focusing on our 4 questions. How does higher education changes our chance of becoming a top earner? Who's getting degrees, and how is that changing, and what does that mean for social mobility, and crucially, are there alternative pathways that matter? That we're moving from graduate payoff to attainment, to social mobility, to the relative importance of higher education for social mobility relative to alternative routes. Our measure of social disadvantage is parental education. That's not perfect, but it allows us to compare across countries consistently. And as we're looking at people aged 35 to 44, we're also sort of looking at what happened higher education in the past in a way. But these are the people who have established career outcomes. This chart, and I should say they're not in order of they're not in order of the report. This is it's figure 2. Sorry. So this chart shows you the tensions around higher education and social mobility. For every country, you see a set of circles representing individuals with graduate parents and a triangle and triangles showing the chances of those with graduate parents of reaching top earnings. The colors represent individual education and attainment. So blue is for non-graduates and green is those who attained a university degree. Across countries, you notice first for those without a university qualification, so the blue markers, parental education makes relatively little difference for the chances of becoming a top earner. About 1 in 10 reaches the top earnings by that age bracket we're looking at. Then look at graduates, so the green markers. The boost is real and substantial in the chances of reaching that top earnings quintile. But in many systems, graduates from advantaged families maintained an edge. On this metric, the UK comes out relatively equal. Disadvantaged graduates are at 32%, which is excellent compared to the non-graduate peers, and advantaged graduates are at 36%. So that's the difference, that's why within the margin of error. The US shows a wider spread. Disadvantaged graduates at about 30%, but advantaged graduates at 41%. What this tells us is that higher education is necessary, but often not sufficient for equalizing life chances. Family background continues to matter even after controlling for degree attainment. Across countries, there was an 11 percentage point increase in degree attainment among first in family students. That's slightly ahead of the 5 percentage point increase among those from more advantaged backgrounds. So the gap in completing succeeding higher education between those two groups is narrowing, but slowly. This is clear policy success. But even after this substantial change in attainment, gaps in university access and success persist, and that's what this chart shows you. It shows you that those from non-graduate backgrounds were half as likely to hold a university degree by the ages 35 to 44 than their more advantaged peers. And what you see here is the gap in university attainment by parental education. In the UK, about 3/4 of adults with graduate parents obtained a degree, compared with 42% of those from non-graduate families, a 33 percentage point gap. In the US, the figures were 59% and 31%. It's about 28 percentage point gap, which sits close at the cross-country average. But here's where the story gets a little concerning. While we see this big change in attainment, up 11 percentage points on average, the higher education uplift fell. So the gap in top earning likelihood between graduates and non-graduates came down and by about 8 percentage points. Think about what that means. More disadvantaged students getting degrees, but each degree is less likely to get you into the top. The trends that in the UK and US match overall patterns, and these are the overall patterns across all the 20 countries in the OECD data. Degrees still matter, but its power to propel people to the top has weakened precisely as more people from disadvantaged backgrounds obtain one. So the result of rising net attainment plus declining payoff is that social mobility, our measure, is flat. And in few countries in our data, it's actually declining. And I'm going to show you the more country specifics next. Across OECD countries, individuals from non-graduate families remain about half as likely to become top earners as their more advantaged peers, essentially unchanged despite all the expansion. And this is, I guess, the paradox we need to address. It doesn't mean that higher education doesn't work. Every country that improved relative social mobility between the PIAC cycles also increased degree attainment, but it may mean that it is maybe not enough on its own. But not all countries tell the same story, and this slide tries to sort of highlight the differences here. 3 countries stand out for combining social mobility with expansion: Ireland, Chile, and Lithuania. What did they do differently? There's a little bit on Ireland in the report, or in the Irish case. Many others expanded access without improving mobility. The UK, for example, saw a big increase in disadvantaged attainment, but only a sort of 6-point gain in relative mobility. The US, a 10-point attainment increase, but only a 2-point gain in relative mobility. And then you have actually countries where mobility declined despite stable or growing access. In our data, that was Singapore and Israel. In Singapore's case, this appears linked to a rapid decline in the higher education uplift. So where does higher education then matter most for reaching the top earnings? This chart shows you how much of the upward mobility for disadvantaged groups comes through higher education versus alternative routes. In the UK, 66% of upward mobility for first and family graduates is via higher education, well above the cross-country median of 58%. That's where the US sits. By contrast, look at Canada, Italy, Austria, and Czechia. In these systems, more than half of mobility into top earnings is for those without graduate parents comes through non-higher education routes. What does that tell us? First, that the UK and US are relying on universities as the pathway for mobility. Second, that this partly may reflect weak alternatives rather than necessarily higher education strength. And that's a theme that comes out in our cross-country case studies as well. Finally, this chart shows that even in the best performing systems, family background still is a still powerful predictor of who reaches the top, and that's figure 1, so we come full circle, figure 1 in the report. No country has yet cracked this. The systems that come closest are actually the UK, Sweden, Austria, and Latvia show relative mobility indices above 60%, meaning disadvantaged families, disadvantaged individuals are roughly 30 to 40% less likely to reach the top than their advantaged peers. The UK performs relatively well, I mentioned that. The US is notably lower. At the other extreme, you have Singapore, Hungary, and Czechia, where disadvantaged families are less than half as likely to reach the top. And I leave it at this point, and Rachel is going to present the second half. Back to you.
Thanks, Golo. So now I'm going to move on to outline some of the main messages from the research as a whole, which draws on our desk research, interviews and workshops, as well as the PIAC data that Golo's been talking about. And the first theme I want to talk about is identifying examples of good practice, because this was something that the Sutton Trust was very keen for us to do, looking across the world and what we can learn from that. And I think while our analysis demonstrates that higher education can play some role in social mobility through what Golo's outlined, there's relatively little robust evidence about specific reforms or initiatives that have helped it realise this ambition. Student funding that we've heard about earlier this morning is important, but research would suggest is not sufficient on its own. But I think when we look at the existing evidence, our expert interviews in particular suggested that multi-pronged approaches might offer a useful way forward in which other parts of the education system are targeted as well as higher education, and also broader areas of social policy. And this is something that could potentially explain why Ireland performs relatively well in the PIAC data in the ways that Golo was talking about. But also I think we can look to the UK and the emerging evidence around contextualised admissions, in which students from disadvantaged backgrounds are offered marginally lower entry conditions. And that emerging evidence does seem to suggest that that has a positive impact on both access and outcomes. And then when we turn to the US, the outcomes of students from disadvantaged backgrounds who attend elite universities have been shown to be particularly good. However, these benefits are experienced by only a relatively small proportion of disadvantaged students. And so the ongoing challenge there is to secure such students equitable access to elite universities, as well as to ensure that such effects are experienced by those attending a broader range of institutions. The second theme I want to talk about is alternative pathways. So debates about social mobility are sometimes framed narrowly around higher education, with success equated to progression into and through university. And this, I think we would argue, can contribute to the marginalisation of those pursuing vocational or technical routes, and the assumption that such educational training pathways are inherently linked with downward mobility. But I think the evidence from our study would suggest that vocational education, training, apprenticeships, technical qualifications, and lifelong learning all can make a significant contribution to social mobility and equity in some countries. And heavy reliance on higher education for achieving such mobility, as we have seen in the case in the UK from the PIAC data, does risk leaving disadvantaged groups with too few options. Where vocational and technical routes are well embedded in integrated tertiary education systems and connected to labour markets, supported by strong institutions, redistributive policies and meaningful employer engagement, they can lead to more equitable approaches to education and training and labour market outcomes. Where such vocational education and technical education are marginalised or stigmatised, there is a risk that inequalities are reinforced by channeling disadvantaged students into less valued routes with limited labour market returns. Linked to that, I think it's important to recognise other drivers of social mobility. We must recognise that higher education participation is one factor among many that may shape people's social mobility journey. Access to and success within higher education is related strongly to earlier stages of education, with academic attainment a key factor shaping higher education participation. the outcomes associated with higher education are also affected by the health of the labour market and the practices of employers. And I think we could look to that to explain some of the kind of disconnect that we've seen in the PIAC data in terms of that labour market payoff for graduates from disadvantaged backgrounds. And in addition, other factors can affect social mobility, such as redistributive tax policies and wage differentials. One of the things that we were interested in exploring through this kind of internationally comparative study was the extent to which policy messages from one national context could be transferred to others. But I think we also in the report raised some kind of concerns about whether this can always be done in a straightforward way. The first relates to the variation in higher education systems across the world. So higher education systems across the world differ widely in terms of their traditions, histories, scale, the extent to which there's horizontal and vertical stratification, and the resources that they have available to them. And so what works in one context may not be effective or appropriate in another. So, for example, although degrees from elite universities were found in our study to have strong signalling effects across most case study countries, equitable access to such institutions is especially relevant in systems that are highly vertically stratified, such as the UK and US, compared to those with flatter institutional hierarchies. It was also quite interesting through our interviews and workshops to discuss how the concept of social mobility is understood and applied differently across countries. And this lack of universally defined terminology in relation to sort of equity in higher education does reflect the diversity of national contexts, but I think also does create some challenges in evaluating and transferring effective policies. And then linked to that, the definitions and policy foci around disadvantaged and underrepresented students also differ across countries. While socioeconomic background remains a common reference point, other intersectional dimensions vary. For example, in Canada and Australia, equity policies often address the specific needs of Indigenous students, whereas in China, targeted policy and funding support is provided to students from rural areas and ethnic minority backgrounds. And I guess despite the trends that Golo outlined in the PIAC data, I think a key challenge for us as a community in the UK and the world is the data on higher education and social mobility. And we did allude to a few of the kind of limitations of the PIAC data previously. And I think a key constraint really in being able to assess with any accuracy the impact of higher education on intergenerational social mobility across the world is the relative paucity of high-quality linkable data in this area. While many countries now do track graduate outcomes, analysis of social mobility specifically is limited by our ability to draw connections between those outcomes and students' socioeconomic origins and educational pathways. Only a handful of systems, notably the Nordic countries, provide this kind of life course linkage. Within the UK, England's longitudinal education outcomes dataset, LEO, does represent an important advance which connects school, college, higher education and early career labour market records. And I think this is one of a number of areas in which there's robust longitudinal evidence to demonstrate the impact of attending higher education. But I think across the world, when we're trying to make international comparisons, without improved linked data, researchers and policymakers will be unable to fully assess how higher education does or does not drive social mobility. So that's a brief outline of some of the kind of key findings from our internationally comparative study, which leads us to the recommendations that you have in the report in front of you, but I'll just talk about briefly now. And I suppose we've split these into two groups. Firstly, around enhancing policy, and secondly, about strengthening the evidence base in this area. So first of all, in relation to enhancing policy, firstly, we think it may be important to take a multi-pronged approach to higher education access and mobility. So despite the limitations of the evidence base in this area, which I've just been talking about, we think that a multi-pronged approach may contribute to improved outcomes in higher education access and social mobility. This means recognising that increasing higher education participation among certain groups or offering financial support to students will not alone be sufficient, and that there's a need for better coordination of policy across different parts of the education system, for example, between schools, both primary and secondary, further education colleges, and higher education institutions. Secondly, to acknowledge interdependencies between higher education institutions and other actors. As part of the multi-pronged approach I've just been talking about, policy should consider the role played in particular by schools in terms of higher education access and the labour market with respect to the demand for graduate labour and the practices of employers. And I think industrial strategy and regional development both also play important roles here. Thirdly, we think it's important to view higher education as one part of a wider tertiary sector. In line with the developing approach in the UK currently that Jackie Smith talked about earlier, policy should focus not on higher education alone, but on the wider tertiary sector to smooth movement for students between different educational pathways and to make better connections between education and the labour market. A key part of this should involve examining how higher and vocational pathways can act in complementary ways as drivers of intergenerational social mobility, acknowledging that diverse educational pathways support diverse pathways to social mobility. We think that heavy reliance on higher education risks leaving disadvantaged groups with too few options. And then widening access to the most selective universities. We think that this is necessary if the potential for higher education to promote social mobility is to be fully harnessed. This could be achieved through higher education access programmes and a more ambitious, widespread use of contextualised admissions, for example. But it's also important to improve the outcomes amongst those attending less selective universities, given that the majority of those from low-income backgrounds attend such institutions. And then moving on to strengthening the evidence base and our recommendations here. Firstly, we think it's important to develop further high-quality national data sets that enable individuals to be tracked across the life course with their outcomes related back to their socioeconomic origins and educational history. While the UK has done significant work in this area over recent years to enable key sets of administrative data to be linked, robust data about the outcomes of education and how they relate to family background are crucial to be able to draw conclusions about the impact of higher education and or other forms of post-compulsory education. And at the moment, that makes it quite difficult to make international comparisons beyond the way which we've done through the PIAC data. Secondly, we think it's important to conduct studies of the long-term impact of specific interventions in higher education and in other forms of post-compulsory education too. At present, many national governments and indeed individual universities have introduced policy measures intended to increase equity in higher education and thus promote social mobility. But there's very little evidence about the efficacy of these particular approaches in the long term, and that is the case across the world, I think. And then finally, the importance of adopting a lifelong perspective. Given the increasing emphasis on and importance of lifelong learning, research should examine the contributions of forms of tertiary education other than higher education to intergenerational social mobility, as well as the impact of higher education pursued later in life. And taken together, we think that those recommendations will make an important contribution to both strengthening policy as well as the data upon which we can assess that policy. So thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rachel and Golo. We're going to move to the first panel of the day now, so if I could ask the panel to come up, that would be great.
You're even older, but I think you're next to you're next to me.
So look, we've got an amazing group to discuss the key themes from the report, who I'll introduce in a moment, but just maybe a few quick reflections from me first. Look, there's a lot in this report. It's a very thick report that landed on your chairs this morning. And I don't know about you, but it certainly took me a couple of reads and a few questions on the phone to Golo on the numbers to fully absorb it. And I think in a way that's because there's a sort of contradiction at the heart of the report. And on the one hand, as you were just saying, it highlights the power of higher education in driving opportunities for individuals. But on the other hand, it also makes clear that despite the efforts of everyone in the room here and many others, growth in higher education has not delivered, improvements in social mobility at the macro level. And, like me, perhaps you've been sort of wondering, well, how can that contradiction be? What's exactly going on there? And I'm certainly thinking, what do we need to do differently? And we've just, started that conversation with the recommendations Rachel's just shared there. So I suppose, these are some of the key questions we'll be getting into on this panel, but also throughout the day. So let me introduce this brilliant panel. So we are joined, in addition to Rachel, by Abel Schumann. So many of you may remember Abel from previous OECD presentations. So Abel is a senior researcher in OECD's Education and Skills team, leads the collection of OECD's education stats, and produces the annual Education at a Glance report, which, not to spare your blushes, is probably the most read report in education globally, I would think. So, look, it's great to have you back with us again, Abel. We also have Professor Lindsey MacMillan. Lindsey is Professor of Economics and a founder of UCL's, I'll get this right, Centre for Education Policy and Equalising Opportunities.
Very good.
Yeah, and Lindsey is a frequent Sutton Trust collaborator, and her work focuses on skills, education, and labour market experience and the role of that in the transmission of incomes across generations, and on the role of family background in access and progression. So Lindsey, great to have you back with us again. We also have Lord David Willetts. So David is currently president of the Resolution Foundation think tank and chair of the UK Space Agency, amongst other things. But most importantly for this panel, David was an MP for 25 years up until 2015, and Minister for Universities in the coalition government some years back, where he was the architect of much of the current funding system, access system and expansion. So David, good to see you again and great to have your expertise on the panel. And Rachel joins us as well, of course. So to kick off, I'm going to just let Abel, Lindsey and David share their reflections on the research for sort of 6-7 minutes each, and then we'll go to questions, and maybe to do the maths for you, that means you've got 20 minutes or so to think of some great questions from the audience. So Abel, do you want to maybe kick us off with your reflections?
Sure. Thank you so much, Nick, for inviting me. It's really a fascinating report, and I think there's a lot of interesting material in there which deserves further discussion. But in the interest of time, I would just like to focus on 2 points that really struck me when reading this report. Now, the first point I would like to go deeper into is really the need that you highlighted to take multi-pronged approaches. And why is this so important? And I think that the reason why this matters so much is that really the inequalities in opportunities in higher education that we see are really just like the last link in a long chain of inequalities that go through the entire education system. And let me just provide a few examples of what I mean with this. So we can look at the very youngest children across OECD countries, so children aged 0 to 2. And when we actually look how the probability that those children are enrolled in early childhood education and care differ by family background, we see that children from families in the bottom third of the income distribution are actually 20% less likely to be enrolled in early childhood education and care than families in the top third of the income distribution. And that is obviously exactly the opposite pattern that we want to see, because the research is very explicit in the sense that children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds are the ones that would benefit the most from early childhood education and care. Now, then we can continue look at children or youth a little bit older. We can look at 15 years old in the PISA study. And when we compare the outcomes of youth in the PISA study across OECD countries, depending on where their families rank in the index of economic, social, and cultural status in the PISA reports, we actually see that those test takers that are in the bottom quarter of this index actually score 100 score points lower than the children that are in the top quarter. And those of you who are familiar with the PISA study know that 100 score points is a large difference. That roughly corresponds to 2.5 years of learning. So again, another huge inequality that we can see at that stage of the life. Now, when we look at let's say, at upper secondary education, so high schools in the US, A-levels here in the UK, and we look at the likelihood of successfully completing upper secondary education, we see that actually youth or young adults that have parents who don't have an upper secondary qualification themselves have a completion rate of 75%. But if we look at those youth that actually have graduate parents, we see that their completion rate is 94%. So there's a huge chain of inequalities that goes through the entire education system, and of course they are compounded by inequalities in the higher education system. But what is important when we think about policies to address those inequalities is really that we have this systemic, this holistic perspective. And it can mean that sometimes to address some of the inequalities in the higher education system that we observe, it can be that early childhood, that policies targeting the early childhood sector are perhaps the most important ones. And here I haven't even started talking about labor market barriers and so on, because of course when we think about the outcomes from higher education, it's not only the higher education system that matters, but it's
the jobs as well. Yeah,
exactly. It's the jobs and the labor market barriers, discrimination in the labor market, and so on. Now that was one very important point. If I have 2 more minutes,
yeah, please go ahead.
I would just like to focus on
2 minutes.
one additional issue, and that is the need for better data that you highlighted very clearly, and that's something that's very close to my heart. Obviously, I work on the
yes.
education statistics, and let me just explain why this is so important. So we have the PIAC study, which is probably the most important data set that we have globally on intergenerational mobility in education. Now, the PIAC study covers, I think, 31 countries. We have roughly 150,000 individuals in this data set, and that sounds like a lot. But let's break that down. So we just look at an individual country, we have 5,000 individuals in the data. Now, we focus only on 35 to 44-year-olds. We are perhaps left with 1,000 individuals. Now, looking only at non-graduates, we perhaps have 500 individuals. Now looking only at non-graduates that have non-graduate parents, perhaps we are left with 200 individuals. And if we are only interested in those that are in the top quintile of the income distribution, perhaps suddenly we end up with just 30 individuals. And this is, of course, a very, very, very small sample to draw conclusions on.
This is why Golo and I were going back and forth on statistical significance, right, as part of this report.
And that doesn't mean that we can't use the data for anything. And I completely believe the general patterns that are identified in the report. But I think it means that we need to be very careful if we want to draw conclusions about individual countries and, for example, say, okay, this country performs better than that country, or this country has improved so much over the last 10 or 11 years. So to really make stronger conclusions and to have more robust evidence, better data is really essential, and that is something we at the OECD try to work on, but there's a lot more work that is needed. So I'm very happy that this came out really strongly from the report.
No, great. No, thank you, Abel. And yeah, I mean, absolutely, the data is important. But also your first point, as you say, the university is just the end point in the chain, right? And so it's all the links in the chain that matter as part of this debate. So no, thank you, Abel. Lindsey, do you want to share your reflections? Yeah.
So thank you to the authors for the report. I find it really interesting, emphasising the nuances of higher education in this really important story of social mobility. So the trend in flattening or declining social mobility is unfortunately one we're all too familiar with here in the UK. The Sutton Trust released a report 20 years ago now, can't believe it was 20 years ago, on the decline in social mobility between the 1958 and the 1970 birth cohort. That was a very important report in terms of all the policy that's happened since. In forthcoming work, we've been able to update this with the 1990 cohort, the first cohort since that Sutton Trust report, and we essentially can show that it's flatlining. Nothing has changed over that period. So it's a bleak story, but it's kept us busy for the last 20 years at least. And the report certainly is showing something similar in terms of first-in-family graduates doing better than their counterparts who didn't go to university. But also, and I have to say most concerningly, these pay gaps persisting within graduate attainment. So people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds essentially still getting paid less than people from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, you know, even if they've overcome all these barriers and gone to university in the first place. This long shadow of family background prevailing in the labour market is something that I'll come back to in a second. Now, I'm going to try not to break into an academic lecture here, but we can think about the role of education in social mobility as three kind of main parts. The first part is educational inequalities, so the relationship between how well you do at school, whether you go to university or not, and where you've come from, your family background. But there's two other parts as well. There's the payoffs to that education that you receive in the labour market, and there's also that direct relationship between where you come from, how well your parents did, and how well you do in the labour market, comparing people that have had very similar educational experiences. Now, typically policymakers, and indeed the Minister this morning, focus very much on the first part, because that's where all the policy levers are, right? We've heard already that attainment gaps start young, they open early in life, and they persist and indeed widen throughout the schooling system, so that by the time you reach kind of higher education, you're dealing with some pretty significant barriers, and the report indeed highlights the real importance of prior attainment in driving this kind of story that we're seeing. But it isn't all about prior attainment. There's a really important role beyond prior attainment when we're thinking about the way in which individuals go to universities and go to different types of universities. And that's where the return story comes into. So there's obviously a return to going to university. You get paid more if you're a graduate compared to a non-graduate on average, but you also get paid more if you go to different types of institutions, right? So people that go to higher ranked universities typically get paid more than those that go to lower ranked universities. And the way in which young people soar into these universities is not equal. So in some work we've done previously, we've shown that low SES young people with the same attainment as high SES young people go to lower ranked institutions. So this isn't just about prior attainment. There is an information, advice and guidance issue going on too. We need to be fixing the way in which young people are viewing different institutions and what they could have access to. And I see you in the audience, Sam. Sam's charity Causeway Education are doing really important interventions here in schools to help young people understand where they could go. We've just done some research looking at private schools and the role of applications in this process, and we can see that across the attainment distribution, private school kids are applying to much higher ranked institutions than their state counterparts with the similar education levels. But let me just, sorry Nick, I will finish soon.
No, you're right.
Beyond the education system, and this is kind of something that I really want to kind of zone in on, Rachel, you talked about the health of the labour market and the practice of employers, and I think that we cannot let employers off the hook here. When we speak to employers, we tend to hear, oh, you know, we just take the best kids from the best institutions. We see consistently that lower SES people, even conditional on where they've gone to university, work in lower paying occupations than their high SES peers. In some new data that we've been collecting over the last, 10 years to be honest, but we've just published a report on it, we can look at the recruitment data of 17 large employers in the UK to answer the question of, are low SES people just not applying to these jobs in the first place, or are they applying but not being hired? And what we see is that there isn't an aspiration gap. They are applying to these graduate programs as much as you would expect them to, given their representation in the graduate population. What is happening is they're getting screened out of recruitment processes compared to high SES applicants who look the same on paper. So these low SES applicants have overcome multiple barriers, have got to the elite institutions, have applied to the graduate training programs, and are still not being hired. 20% less likely to get a job offer than their high SES counterparts with exactly the same qualifications. We cannot let employers off the hook. Finally, we also need to think about the structural barriers. A study I did with John Jerram back in 2015 also used the PIAC data to look at the importance of education and social mobility and inequality. And consistently, we see that societies with higher levels of inequality have lower levels of social mobility, and higher education is playing an important role in this. And it makes sense, right? If the stakes are higher, if you've got further to fall, parents will do more and more to ensure that their kids are not the ones that fall down the ladder. So more advantaged parents will take action and will do everything they can to protect their advantaged children from experiencing downward mobility. The reproduction of inequalities becomes all the more important in high inequality societies. Finally, last point, I'm always a big fan of reports that call for data improvements. You're right, we have made a lot of progress with the Leo data, and we've been able to do a lot of work based on that, but I don't think we're done. We have terrible measures of family background in the Leo data. We can only measure a very blunt, dichotomous view of whether a child is disadvantaged or not. And actually, we should be trying to be ambitious here and thinking about ways in which, with this unique single child identifier, we might be able to get family income data into the administrative data records to make better targeted policy-making decisions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lindsay. Multiple key points there. So type of university matters. But even for kids who have the same degree from the same university, the labour market returns are not the same.
Yep.
Okay. David, on to you next.
Yeah, and look, and I agree with those points that Lindsay's just made. Yeah. So it is a fantastic report. Thank you so much to both Carnegie and the Sutton Trust for it. For me, as a layperson, I found the chart on page 20 shows some of the challenges we've been talking about, and Golo has already referred to it. But just to check, for me as a layman, interpreting this chart on page 20, what it seems to me to say is if you look at for the UK, the green triangle, the green circle, it says if you've got a degree and your parents didn't go to university, you've got a 32% chance in Great Britain of getting into a high earning job. And if you get a degree and your parents had a degree, you've got a 36% chance. So indeed, that 4% is a real gap. However, if you look down below at the blue figures, it tells you if your parents had a degree and you don't have a degree, you've got a 15% chance of being in a high earning job. And if your parents don't have a degree and you don't have a degree, you've got a 12% chance. So, of course, this tells us about gaps in rewards if your parents are graduates or non-graduates. But the big gap is between going to university and not going to university. Mm. And this brings out, for me, the power of higher education in transforming opportunities. If you have got graduate parents and you don't get a degree, 15% chance of a high earning job. If your parents didn't have a degree but you do, 32% chance of a high earning job. So now there are lots of qualifications, but that is a starting point, just reminding us that we have got here a very powerful instrument that can do a lot of good. Now turning on to the reasons, and Lindsay has touched on some of them, why it doesn't always work as well as we would like. I can remember evidence, and actually this led me to shift policy in terms of, can we promise that policy will always be stable? We started off with access funding, for universities access funding, very much focused on trying to help encourage kids from disadvantaged backgrounds to go to university. But Lindsey is absolutely right. It then, and indeed, we know that contextualized admissions work. One of the reasons why contextualized admissions work is higher education is the only stage of education where the kids from the disadvantaged backgrounds outperform. They're the only stage of education where for a given set of A-levels when you arrive, if you are disadvantaged, you are likely to do slightly better. Your chances of getting a 2-1 or a first are actually slightly higher than for more advantaged kids. So again, part of the power of higher education, it's the only one that delivers that. However, the bad news, which Lindsey correctly refers to, is that for any given level of degree attainment, then if you come from a socially disadvantaged background, you do, for any given prior university achievement, you do slightly less well, which is one of the reasons why we changed the policy to encourage universities for any given pot of money they'd got, not just to spend it on access to get the students in, but on things like financing them. If there's an internship program during the summer holidays and Danny doesn't have a flat in London, help with the accommodation costs to do the internship. So encouraging universities to think of following through and supporting their students from more disadvantaged backgrounds into the labour market. Just then some other quick comments. We've heard eloquently from Abel the argument about you've got to look at all the other stages. I personally think higher education, given its power in delivering this massive transformation in people's prospects compared with students, people who don't have a degree, I personally think it has had rather a raw deal in the amount of attention paid to funding it. And indeed, sometimes I think the focus on early years does damage. I think the focus, in terms of some of what Lindsey was saying, when the focus on early years is associated with some pretty bogus neuroscience, which kind of says your brain is fixed, there's nothing much we can do for you by the age of 5, that kind of justifies universities and later stages of education not reaching out to people with apparently low levels of attainment. Somehow these Calvinists have told us our fates are already fixed. My view is that the evidence is there's quite a lot of neuroplasticity and we change through our educational lives even later. So some of the arguments for early years, I think, have done real damage to social mobility. And also, and look, we kept the maintenance grants. I thought Jackie Smith was absolutely right to say we need to bring them back, and I very much regret that Sajid Javid, I think it was, got rid of them. However, Jackie also said in passing in her excellent speech, we spend £3 billion on the pupil premium. There is absolutely no equivalent of the pupil premium in higher education. And if I may say so, I think a really useful exercise for the Sutton Trust to try to get a balance between the different stages that Abel was talking about is a minister say, almost every education minister I have known has said the priority is early years, that's why we're going to carry on cutting funding for higher education. And even when you do bring back maintenance grants, it's financed out of levy. I think it's a legitimate question for public policy when resources are limited. If you have £500 million to spend, how much social mobility do you buy with spending it at different stages of the process? And here's a system where you're spending £3 billion on a pupil premium in schooling and have zero pupil premium to help students from disadvantaged backgrounds in their right university. Is this the correct balance? And the reason why it's ended up like this is because people like Abel are so eloquent on the importance of the early stages. But have we ended up, it's a genuinely neutral question, with a properly well-balanced and effective mix of public spending? Then, just if I may, 2 final comments. First, and then the vocational route in data. We're all calling for more data, so let me join the club of social scientists asking for more data. The data I would like is to try to measure what vocational and technical education is being delivered. The problem with the call for more vocational and technical routes is that these terms are so poorly defined. Higher education means level 4 and above. Are people saying that we need more focus on level 2 and level 3? And I happen to agree. I think probably the worst single problem in English education is the writing off of people who don't get good GCSEs at the age of 16. However, a lot of higher education is vocational and technical. The distinction between, on the one hand, something called higher education and something else called vocational and technical education is a total muddle. It just confuses the debate. So what I would like to see, and the data is extremely hard to obtain, I would like to know how many people in higher education, particularly at university, are getting a license to practice as a result of their higher education. And even that is a simple measure. It is currently not possible to ask and get a proper answer how many, let's narrow it even more, how many university students are studying for a specific job-required qualification. You could then do an update on a piece of work I think Henseke did 20 years ago. How many people who graduate from higher education are going, as a result of their course, into a clear occupational category? They had a really interesting piece of research where they took courses where the graduates were concentrated in 3 specific occupations or less, and took that as a measure of, if you like, the vocationality of the course. So my view is that the technical and vocational contrast with HUB, we had helped sweep away some of this confusion if we knew a little bit more about technical and vocational education delivered in higher education. And then my final point is we have here been talking very much about earnings as the measure of social mobility. And it does look as if the graduate premium has fallen a bit. I mean, there's a debate about how much, and to some extent it's a consequence of more graduates. However, there are lots of other benefits from being a graduate, which may be regarded as constituting a contribution to social mobility, depending on how you measure it. Graduates have better health outcomes. If you try to stick an economic value on the better health outcomes of graduates, it's up there alongside the earnings premium. And the good news is, it looks as if the health benefit from going to higher education is not dependent on your subsequent employment. Graduates in so-called non-graduate jobs appear to enjoy similar health benefits to graduates in so-called graduate jobs. So my other suggestion on data is this debate on how you get social mobility should include other benefits, and it may tell us an even more powerful story about the contribution of higher education to social mobility.
Nice.
Brilliant. No, thank you, David. Lots to unpack in there as well. I feel a bar chart on social mobility per pound spent by stage coming on. Lindsey, perhaps there's a report we can do together on that. I just want to pick up on one, just building on David's thoughts there, just pick up on one point and ask a question to Rachel and then maybe anybody else on the panel before we go to audience questions, which is, look, this report absolutely makes the power of universities clear. And that sort of, for me, puts the spotlight back on the access gap question. And, you know, you can see from the numbers, many more disadvantaged young people have gone to university. We've closed access gaps a little bit, but not that much, actually, when you look at how the curves have been tracking. And so, you know, interested, Rachel, in your reflections on, like why is that, do you think, over the last 20 years? Why have we made only modest progress in closing those access gaps at the end of the day?
Well, I would say, you think about the UK in
particular? The UK is a many countries share the same characteristic, I think. I suppose I was mainly talking from the Sutton Trust UK experience, yeah.
I mean, I think there are a variety of factors to that. I mean, I think there's the kind of, you know, I guess cultural factors about it being normalised within particular families and, you know, that kind of family influence there. I think, you know, the cost, that it is very significant, and now it's not just kind of, you know, that kind of accumulation of debt. It's also the fact that, as I think Nick Hillman talked about the first question, about kind of, you know, having to work alongside study, that perhaps that isn't a very attractive proposition to many young people. So I think there are probably kind of, the research would suggest there are kind of multiple factors, but I think, you know, that cultural factor probably shouldn't be overlooked, the way in which certain transitions are normalised within, you know, families and particular types of school that may be different for advantaged and non-advantaged students.
Yes. No, thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that? Lindsey, do you
Yeah, we put a briefing note out on this very topic, actually, earlier this year. It's a bit of a travesty, really, how many millions of pounds has been spent in this area. and how little we actually know about what works for widening access and participation. And the evaluation of these types of various different programs that every different institution tries to implement are tricky because everyone's doing something slightly different, which means we can't really get any good impact evaluation going. But I think that universities have a duty to really think about the way in which they're designing their interventions to widen participation and access, so that we can actually get a better handle on what works and where there's value for money, because the amount of money we're spending on things that we really can't actually tell whether they work or not is really unacceptable as a sector.
No, thank you. Anyone else particularly want to come in on that, or should we go to audience? Let's maybe start audience questions. Anyone want to kick us off in the audience with the question? Sally, go on. Yeah, there's a mic from Ryan there, yeah.
Thank you. I've got a question for Rachel, please. You've made a lot of references to the UK, but the approach to access and indeed the delivery of higher education in Scotland is very different indeed from England. So can you clarify when in this report you're actually drawing on data that, as you indicate, is UK-wide, and when you're not? And does that mean that actually there are aspects, you would say, of the Scottish system that you simply haven't looked at?
Yes, I think if you look at the English case study in the case study bit of the report, and then we've also written a much longer appendix that goes with the report, we kind of make that point explicitly, and that most of our discussion is about England, although where we have got UK data, we do talk about that. So we do make that kind of distinction, and the focus is primarily on England rather than the other home nations.
Great, thank you. Anybody at the back there? Please just say name and organisation if you wouldn't mind, just before your question.
Shemai Pal Borazar. My name's Rachel Layton. I'm the head of widening access at Cardiff University. I suppose I'm asking the researchers on the panel to futurecast here, which is maybe a bit unfair of me. But I'm wondering either what we know so far or what research is planned for, or analysis is planned for around the impact of austerity policies on educational outcomes and social mobility. So things like closure of Sure Start centres or a removal of EMA in England. We still got it in Wales. On educational outcomes and social mobility more generally. So what do we know so far, and what research is planned for?
Brilliant, thank you. Who wants to see Lindsey writing? Do you want to jump in first? Or?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. It's a hard one, and I think it's a little early, Rachel. I think the trends that we've seen so far, I mean, there was some improvements actually in the educational attainment gaps from 2010 up until the pandemic. It's hard to know exactly how much of that is to do with policies that were happening at exactly that time or legacy policies. These things are always very, very hard to disentangle. Obviously, since the pandemic, things look a lot bleaker. That's not austerity driven necessarily, but I think that there was some, what we do know from the IFS report is that Sure Start was a very positive policy that had long-term positive impact on GCSE outcomes and beyond. What Sure Start didn't have was immediate policy impact, and that meant that it was open to being cut when austerity was implemented. And I think that there's a lesson or a learning for policymakers there in terms of things which don't have immediate impact, could well have longer term impacts, and we might not want to cut everything instantly. EMA, the research on EMA is a little bit more mixed, and actually the most recent research from the IFS on the EMA has not been wholly positive. It seems like it didn't have fantastic outcomes actually for the students that qualified to get it, which was perhaps surprising, but we need to learn from that might not be the best use of the money. I think the only other thing that
is kind of relevant for that period of time is the recent Bath report on the raising of the participation age, and showing that the way in which that was actually implemented, with the removal of various other supports at that time, meant that it hasn't necessarily had the outcomes you might have anticipated from other policies where we've seen a raising of a participation age or a raising of a school leaving age having a broadly positive impact on young people, due to a lack of accountability, essentially, and a decimation of local authorities' ability to help young people or make sure they're going to the institutions post-16. Bath has found that actually the raising of participation age, if anything, was associated with kind of increased dropout among individuals attending further education colleges. And there's this strange loophole in the benefit system where you can get child benefit if you stay on at further education colleges, but you can't get it if you study an apprenticeship. And so there was some suggestion that what's happened with that not being closed is that there was potentially young people going to courses that weren't necessarily beneficial to them to make sure that their family kept retaining that benefit for those 2 years. So there's a whole raft, I get a whole kind of range of different things that happened over that period, and it's really hard to know, you know, one way or another how much of it was directly related to austerity. I didn't mean to point at you there, David, when I said that. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Go on, Richard, do you want to just quickly come in on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, just to say that our report is a retrospective analysis, so we were looking at stuff that had already been published, not that might be commissioned in the future. But I guess the kind of broader point is that wider context, that economic context does matter. And I think, you know, in our case study countries, we do give various examples of that. For example, Greece, you know, the kind of, you know, very significant impact of the 2008 kind of, you know, crash and recession, how that kind of directly impacted the higher education sector and outcomes from that. So I think, you know, the broader point about paying attention to that wider labour market and economic context is evidenced in our report, even though it's not future looking in terms of the UK or England.
I think, Abel, you want to quickly just...
Yeah, perhaps I can add a little bit from an international perspective. So what we have seen over the last 20-25 years essentially is that tertiary attainment across OECD countries has been rising relatively steadily by roughly 1 percentage point per year. And when we break this down by parental background, we see that tertiary attainment rates among those with graduate parents are actually now pretty close to 80%. In some countries, they're even above 80%. And that, of course, means that there's not much scope for them to rise further.
Nowhere else to go there.
Yeah, exactly. So we're reaching nearly 100% tertiary attainment. And that, of course, raises the question, what then happens? Because for 20 years, we had this kind of parallel trend where attainment rates have been rising for those with parental and with parents with graduate degrees and those without have been rising relatively steadily. But now the top can't move any further. And now the question is, will the attainment actually for those without, with parents without degrees, will that continue to rise? And that not only has implications on inequality and social mobility, but it actually also has broader macroeconomic implications. Because if we want the general attainment in the general population to continue to increase, it means that we really have to focus on those from families without degrees. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to sustain that trend that we had in the last 20 years.
David, do you want to just quickly comment on that as well? Yeah,
just some quick comments on that. I mean, I think one way in which we can look forward to future improvements in the data is as the LEO data matures. And look, I was heavily involved in the battles to get HMRC data made available and linked to education data. But I'm very aware that that research only really now gives us accurate information up to graduates aged about 40. And there's a very lively debate about the extent to which higher education enables you to carry on enjoying increases in earnings for longer, whereas some of the vocational courses you get onto a plateau, you get allocated very rapidly, and you may in your 20s be doing it as well as a graduate, but you may not necessarily have the same long-term perspective. So I think we'll have better data on long-term performance. Secondly, Something I'm also very aware of, because we at Resolution Foundation have been involved in advocating this. We're now seeing a very significant increase in the minimum wage and national living wage. That is having a marked effect on non-graduate earnings, because so many non-graduates are concentrated around that wage level. One of the factors, therefore, lowering the graduate premium is a deliberate policy of a group of other people who are low paid and are predominantly non-graduates gaining, which is a good thing. It doesn't tell you that higher education has become less valuable or useless. So you've got to put all these in a wider context, and I think the more data our social scientists have to do that kind of thing, the better.
No, it's a good point. I mean, in London, the London living wage is not far off a typical graduate starting salary now, right? So it's absolutely that convergence. I think we had another question just on the, yes.
Hi, my name is Omar. I'm the CEO of Tezo. I was just picking up Lindsey's point on evaluation. I do think it's a challenge evaluating. We are running a multi-site randomized control trial on summer schools. And it is a challenge that universities select into summer schools, and so getting them to agree not to select can be a challenge in order to run a proper impact evaluation. We have managed to do that. I have an additional concern at the moment, which is that we also know that a lot of these activities are recruitment activities, and that universities are competing with students.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why finance departments sign off on widening participation activities is not merely for social justice reasons, but for balance sheets. And I'm concerned that in the current environment that consideration may sharpen, and we know that there are a few schools where the top schools all seek to recruit those kids from, and we even see in our data that some kids are going on 5 or 6 summer schools, and you might think the marginal return of the 4th, 5th, and 6th summer schools is not so high. So I guess, I do want to also, though, say the sector is doing a lot of good work, and we're pulling together a library, which I think will respond to your the other part of your point, Lindsey, which is there is a lot of duplication of activities that, while in different contexts, I think are similar, like mentoring programs, these kinds of activities, and in the spring, we will be launching a library of all of the different kinds of evaluations that are happening, which will allow the sector to analyze them. But my question was David's point on graduates, and it does link to Jackie Smith's point around status. I was struck by that chart that the graduate children who don't get a degree are still not very likely to get high earnings, which suggests that even if you're from a middle-class parent, not getting a degree is bad for you. And this picks up Lindsey's point about downward social mobility. Surely, in order to improve the status and pay of those non-graduate routes, we need more children of graduate parents going to those routes, and if even they are not able to get good wages in those routes, that is a real problem, because middle-class parents are rational then not to want their kids to do non-graduate routes. The people who determine status in our society are those who currently have status. And if they are saying, and they are rationally correct to be saying, my kids are going to do badly if they don't get a degree, that is bad for social mobility generally, but specifically then for the sort of non-graduate population specifically.
No, interesting one. David, do you want to come back on that?
I mean, I'm trying to, what are these well-paid jobs that non-graduate children of graduate parents do? They can't all be estate agents in Kensington using their social capital to sell high-value houses. Look, my view is that and I think here I probably am disagreeing with some of the arguments in the pamphlet, there's such a powerful drive into higher education, especially amongst, as you say, more middle-class parents, that the expanding higher education so that more and more people have that opportunity, given it still seems to work quite well, seems to me an obvious first lever to pull. And indeed, so removing number controls just so that more people go. And Nick Kilman has said in public he can see a world where 70% of people going into higher education. I do think this is an underlying trend. So focusing on getting as many people as possible into higher education and then dealing with the problems Lindsey identifies of their subsequent labour market performance does seem to me to be a priority. Oh, and sorry, and just to add, some of these other routes, sorry, it's not, and I think this is uncomfortable evidence in a way, but if you want to find an apprenticeship that is highly socially selective, look at degree apprenticeships. And we now know from the research that for a given subject, the degree apprenticeship is more socially selective than the equivalent classic, conventional university course. Because we do at least monitor access and social background of people going to university. We do not track and in any way try to manage the social backgrounds of people going into apprenticeships. There's clearly some apprenticeships that are themselves now highly socially selective, absolutely. But that's sort of just accepted. That's no measurement or monitoring or public policy about that.
Well, there's some apprenticeships harder to get into than Cambridge, I think, at the moment. So, Lindsey, you wanted to come in as well, I think.
Yeah, I think... I mean, I agree with David. When people are saying we shouldn't have as many people going to university, they don't mean their kids, right?
Yes.
That's important. And so we should always remember that. And I believe that we should expand education. Education for education is good. What I wanted to say was my colleague Fabian Petit, who was at CPO, is now at Barcelona, did a paper looking at the role of occupation structure and the trends in social mobility over time in the UK, and really found an important role for this hollowing out of the middle jobs. Mm-hmm. So I think there's definitely a role for industrial strategy here with regards to thinking about the types of jobs we want to create as a society that could fill some of that gap. Because at the moment, if you've got, essentially a quite, separate distribution of jobs with kind of top jobs and then maybe lower paid jobs, there is really no gap there for anywhere to go, Omar. And then what are we doing? I think a proper joined-up strategy, which is, I don't know, we've been talking about this probably for decades, but a joined-up strategy between the education sector and the labour market would be a really sensible approach to this.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. I'm going to go to John. I think I had a question earlier, then I'm going to come on to at the front and then this side. I mean, I realise I've been leading this way, so I'm looking for questions on this side in a moment. Go on.
Yeah, thanks. A super helpful discussion. David's point about a pupil premium for higher education, perhaps to look at the Australian Accord, which makes that very proposal that there should be an extra premium paid for disadvantaged students in Australia. The question, however, is a general one. I think it's really super important we look at who's getting the very highest incomes. But is there a risk to reducing debates on social mobility on the 20% highest earners? If we have a participation system in higher education where you're 40 and 50% of participation, then surely we should be looking at social mobility in terms of the 40 or 50% highest earnings. Okay. And it gets back to Louise's opening point. There is a risk, if you like, if we talk about higher education in very elite terms, and we need to broaden that debate out. So while this is super important, and I'm absolutely not bringing down the research, surely it's only part of the discussion on social mobility.
Anybody? Rachel, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, despite being an author of the report, I would completely agree with you. Ultimately, we needed to use some measure for the analysis, and that's the one we chose. But I think we would completely agree with your analysis that, also it links, I guess, to David's point about thinking about the value of higher education more broadly. It isn't just about economics. Although I guess if we're thinking about labour market, yes, there's the percentage that we use, but there's also the status attached to jobs, which might not map on neatly to income. But I think those broader purposes, graduates are much more likely to be involved civically as well as having the health benefits, etc. So I think that broader discussion about the value of higher education, which isn't often played out in the media, actually. I think that the media can be quite complicit in this. I think that is really important not to lose sight of, and perhaps puts our research into it in a broader context.
Great. I'm going to go a question at the front here, and then we'll come over this side.
Actually, mine was a very similar point. I'm Mary Kernock Cook. An impeccable source on my iPhone tells me that 20% higher earnings level is about £45,000 salary in this country. And I think I'd be right in saying that that's probably 4 or 5 years' experience for a teacher or a nurse to get to that level, but could also be the starting salary in a Magic Circle law firm. And I think also now, isn't it true that nuclear welders can earn £50,000 pretty much as soon as they know how to do a bit of welding? So I think my question is again around this definition of social mobility, and I accept that the salary level is a reasonable proxy to take, especially when you're doing it across multiple different nationalities. But I just wondered, David, you made the point. Could people say a bit more about what they really think social mobility is and means?
Yeah, who wants to?
Yeah,
Lindsey, do you want to start?
happy to. It's a timely question because I think the House of Lords report that came out yesterday was really nice on this. It emphasised that I think we as a society have moved away, or at least in terms of the submissions and evidence they've had. So we as a group of people who might have submitted to that think about social mobility, and we have moved away, I think, from a definition of social mobility as one in which the deserved few, most academically able, disadvantaged young people, get siphoned off and sent to Oxbridge and sent to the top jobs in the labour market, and think about it a lot more broadly as a concept in which opportunities should be equal for young people regardless of their background to do whatever they want to do to fulfil their potential. And I think that broader definition then kind of puts the focus on equalisation of opportunities rather than outcomes, if that makes sense. So naturally, when we are doing the quantitative analysis, we do actually have to use measures, and we have to make decisions on what those measures are, and typically they're based on the constraints of what's available in the data. David helped create a data set which has earnings as the main outcome, and that is typically something we focus on. So data improvements will help us broaden our ability to do quantitative analysis in a more kind of nuanced and wider way, as David has said.
There's a properly acrimonious academic dispute behind all this, partly between different disciplines, because there's the bottom quintile to the top quintile model, which Sutton Trust has really pushed, and it is very interesting data. Someone like John Goldthorpe would say that that if only sociologists had a look in, and you were thinking about employment status, status of different types of work, you would have a completely different picture of social mobility. And so the different data sets that Lindsey rightly called for also names a much richer discussion about what constitutes social mobility.
Any other comments on that? Rachel, go on.
Yeah, I mean, also just to shout out for qualitative research as well here, I think that actually qualitative studies would suggest, when students are actually kind of interviewed about what they value about their higher education, yes, the employment outcomes are important, but there are a whole range of other things that they value as well, which, perhaps aren't always mentioned in these kind of debates about the value of higher education.
Yeah. And Abel, did you want to comment from a...
Perhaps I can also say a few words.
Which countries do what?
Maybe not so much focusing on the data at this point, but I think when we think about social mobility, there are essentially two dimensions. There's the equality of opportunity, and that is probably something we can all agree that we want to achieve that. And then the second dimension is the overall level of inequality in a society, and those two measures, they are not necessarily related. And I think whereas on the first aspect, there's probably a consensus that we want to have equality of opportunity. The question of how much inequality in a society we want, that's a different one. That's a very political one, and there are different societies come to different consensuses. And that, of course, concerns income, but it also concerns issues like David mentioned, health outcomes, life expectancy. Are we comfortable with a society in which individuals that don't have an upper secondary qualification have a life expectancy that's 12 years lower than those who have a graduate degree? And that is a question where different societies come to different conclusions, but I think it's an important one that we need to keep in mind.
Yeah. No, and I would thank you, Abel, and I would say maybe from the Sutton Trust perspective, we would, from our perspective, it's not just about bottom to top mobility, that is important, but it's about mobility at all levels of the distribution. That's what really drives social mobility at the macro level. I suppose we've always taken the view that if you have to have one measure, the income one is probably the least worst measure. Clearly, it would be better to have a basket of measures, but if you go for one, that feels like the most sensible for us as a single measure. I'm looking for last two questions from this side of the audience. I'm going to go to the lady in the middle there first, and then right at the back. Sorry, and then we'll see where we're doing for time.
Hi, Allie Lyons from Imperial College London, and I actually wanted to pick up on this point about qualitative insights. I'm very much all for more data, but surely it seems like the gaps that we're seeing persisting in some of the outcomes for university students suggest that there's actually more going on within the degree experience itself. I'm thinking of sort of harder to measure things like social and cultural capital, as well as some of the points we've heard this morning around who's having to do part-time work and what that means they're giving up and those factors. And given how much easier it is to measure degree attainment and degree completion and the emphasis that the OFS puts on those measures, how do we make sure that that wider concept of the student experience isn't lost in terms of universities' priorities, but is also taken seriously in conversations like this? Because I think it's really easy to dismiss that qualitative piece as anecdotal, even though it might be a really important factor in what's actually going on for students.
Rachel, do you want to start on that one? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's a great book that illustrates this really well, The Degree Generation by Nicola Ingram and colleagues, where they, it's based on a paired peers project where they tracked, they matched students from the University of Bristol with students at the University of West of England, and they followed them through and now into the labour market, so a longitudinal piece of qualitative research. And I think that book speaks quite powerfully to the challenges that students from disadvantaged backgrounds face both in university and then when they're making the transition into the graduate labour market. And that talks about kind of, the institutional cultures, the family resources that they bring or don't bring, but also, as Lindsey was talking about, the kind of, practices of employers and how those can, often serve to compound disadvantage there. So I think there is evidence out there, and perhaps it doesn't get as much media attention as nice graphs that look at income, but I think there is plenty of evidence that we can draw on to identify some of those barriers, both within higher education and in that interface with the labour market.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a very powerful point. And it was interesting, I thought Jackie, though she described it completely neutrally, but Jackie in her speech talked about perhaps more students going to their local university. And I think one of the effects of, sadly, the reduction of maintenance support and other changes in the university experience means we may see more commuter students. We know the more affluent your parents, the greater the distance between your family home and your university. So we know that what the affluent parents do is it's part of the route, the transition to adulthood. You clearly move away from home and have an experience in a totally different environment. If we are, without any open policy discussion, just shifting to a view that more and more students will be commuter students, we know who the commuter students will be, and whether they have the kind of, if you like, full classic undergraduate experience, I think is open to question.
Mm-hmm.
Lindsey, go on.
Yeah, we also know that if you're looking at students that stay at home, the high SES student is going to be choosing the Russell Group University, and the low SES student is going to be choosing potentially the post-92 institution in that same town on average, and so that's going to be baking in some inequalities as well. Can I just say on the qualitative point, the very best research nowadays does both. The class pay gap is another good example, I think, of a book which combines quantitative evidence with qualitative evidence in the labour market discrepancies in terms of who gets on. So progression in the labour market by socioeconomic background, that's by Sam Friedman and Daniel Lorison. And they are superb at setting out the picture in terms of the catchy graph and then adding the really important colour to what's going on beneath those bars. And I think the way in which policymakers are convinced in this space is by having both. And that's why this report is really great, I think, as well, bringing together the two different elements to really pick apart the story in a much more nuanced way.
Great, no, thank you. Do you have qual across the OECD data or no?
Nothing to add.
No.
That's excellent.
So we're going to one last question right at the back there with a hand up. Can't actually see.
Hi, thanks so much for the panel. I'm Victoria Ideji. So I'm actually a Sutton Trust alumni, so I did the Cambridge Summer School almost a decade ago. And then I ended up applying to Cambridge and I graduated from there a few years ago. And then I joined the Sutton Trust Alumni Leadership Board. So yeah, I have a lot to owe to the Sutton Trust. So my question is around networks and universities. So kind of quite similar to what Sam Friedman mentions in the Class Pay Gap book, is that networking, having a career sponsor, having someone to advocate for you in the room, especially when you enter your early career, is going to be really important. So my question is, what role do you think universities have in maximizing their alumni networks? So I think compared to the US, focusing on alumni is not necessarily a really, really big thing in the UK. So yeah, what role do you think universities can have in maximising the alumni network to kind of, really support those who are from a less economically advantaged background, especially as they go into their early career journey as well?
No, brilliant. Thank you. Who wants to jump in on that? Go on, Lindsey, you do it, kick us off here.
I think universities got a lot they can do in this space, to be honest, based on the research that we've been doing. I think the alumni network is one example of an area in which that could be strengthened. There's a lot of differences across institutions in the use of that. Other examples are, we found a really important role for the date of application, that people from different backgrounds were applying to graduate training programs, which I think tells you something very important about the careers advice and guidance that universities could be offering their students from different backgrounds. And this varied a lot by the types of institutions that we were talking to too. So some of the institutions were really on it and getting their students into, apparently there's something called a spring week in the first year of university now, and then an internship, and then you've got to apply. I mean, if you're from a lower socioeconomic background and you've got to university and you're first in your family to go there, you're going to celebrate the fact you got in for a minute before you're starting to think about what spring job you need to get in your first year, right?
If you haven't applied by week 2,
it's madness. Yeah, so, I mean, as someone who was first in the family to go to university, I was definitely not thinking about my graduate career when I started university. And I think that there's just a ton that universities could do in this space for thinking about the ways in which people from different backgrounds are turning up and what they need to be able to get them, at least in the same place as individuals from more advantaged backgrounds with that kind of parental experience.
What is frustrating is that we know quite a lot now about graduate earnings from particular universities in particular courses. I think sometimes the data is overinterpreted or stuff, but it is out there. And it's used to feed into a political debate about closing down the courses with the bad earnings. What's really important, surely, especially as these people have already been to university, is what more can universities do? How can we link up the data on poor performance in graduate earnings and go back to the university and say, well, what more can we do? We stay in touch with these people. Why are these programs that you have operated appearing in some areas to be delivering poor returns? Can we think of a refresher course? Can we think of ways in which, even at this stage, when they may be 10 years into their job career, more can be done to help them? And I think keeping university, you're absolutely right, keep university in touch. And there is, I won't try to explain my proposal, but I always wanted to see some extra reward for universities if they do better on graduate earnings as measured by student loan repayments than would be expected given their course and the social mix of their students. That it would not be the one to be on the wit of man to design such an incentive scheme for universities.
Nice. Great idea. Any other final comment, Rachel, and then Abel, you've got the final word.
Just one suggestion. I guess I did some work for TESO a few years ago about widening access to placements which are part of a degree, and I think alumni networks can play an important role in those, in kind of facilitating those type of opportunities for young people, because I think the data shows that if you do one of those, it has quite a significant impact on your outcomes when you eventually take up a full-time job in the labour market.
Abel, any thoughts? Or?
Thanks again. Nothing to add from my side, except to congratulate the authors and the Sutton Trust for that fantastic report.
No, thank
really
you.
And excellent.
Thank you, Abel. And look, I think we are out of time there, so I think it's now thank you to the panel as well. Thank you. Time for a well-earned cup of coffee now at the back.